The snow had begun falling over Berlin shortly after dusk, soft flakes drifting through the cold air like silent witnesses. In the quiet diplomatic quarter near the Tiergarten, the lamps glowed dimly through the gathering fog, illuminating the elegant facade of the Adelhof residence, an old Prussian mansion now serving as a discreet guesthouse for foreign officials. Inside, the night porter had just completed his routine inspection when the first sign of trouble appeared. Room 217, occupied by Dr. Matthias Keller of the Foreign Ministry, was still locked from the inside. This alone was not unusual. What was unusual was the silence. Dr. Keller had been expecting an important courier earlier that evening. The porter remembered clearly because the man had insisted on absolute privacy and had instructed that no one disturb him under any circumstances. Yet when the courier arrived shortly after 9, there was no response to the knock, no footsteps, no voice. At first they assumed Keller had stepped out, but the key was still inside the lock. The porter tried again. He knocked harder this time. The echo carried down the quiet corridor. Nothing. By 10 o'clock, concern had turned into unease. The manager was summoned. A second key was fetched, though it proved useless with Keller's key still lodged inside the door. Finally, with growing alarm, they forced the door. The scene inside the room would later puzzle the Berlin police for days. Dr. Matthias Keller was dead. He sat upright in a leather armchair beside the small writing desk, his body slumped slightly forward, his expression oddly calm, as if death had come quietly in the middle of a thought. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Even more curious, there was no visible wound. The doctor appeared simply to have stopped living. On the desk beside him lay an open leather portfolio. Several diplomatic documents had been carefully arranged in neat stacks. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet one envelope had clearly been opened. It was empty. The windows were closed from the inside, frost gathering along their edges. The heavy velvet curtains had not been touched. The balcony door was locked. The only entrance to the room, the one they had forced open, had been secured from within. A perfect locked room. But that was not the detail that unsettled the officers most. It was the object resting on the desk beside Keller's hand. A single red chess piece, a rook. Inspector Vogel of the Berlin Kriminalpolizei turned the small wooden piece between his fingers as the room buzzed with quiet activity. Photographers documented the scene. A medical officer examined the body. A chess piece, Vogel muttered. The manager nodded nervously. Dr. Keller did not play chess, as far as I know. The inspector studied the desk again. The rook had been placed carefully, deliberately beside the empty envelope. A message? Vogel suggested. But if it was a message, no one understood it. The medical officer finally stood and removed his gloves. "Poison," he said quietly. Vogel frowned. "Injected?" "Number." The doctor shook his head slowly. "No puncture wound, no residue, nothing obvious. Yet the symptoms suggest a fast-acting toxin. Administered how?" "That," the doctor replied, glancing at the untouched glass of water on the desk, "is the mystery." The inspector moved toward the door again, studying the key still stuck on the inside of the lock, locked from within. Windows sealed. No weapon, no poison container. And now, an empty diplomatic envelope whose contents had vanished. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the distant sounds of the city. Vogel turned once more toward the desk and the small crimson rook. In chess, the rook was a piece of strategy, straightforward, powerful, and often decisive in the final moves of a game. But here, in a silent room with a dead diplomat and a missing document, the meaning felt far darker. Somewhere in Berlin, someone had made the first move, and the game had only just begun. By the following morning, the snow had settled across Berlin like a white curtain, muting the city and lending the diplomatic quarter an almost unnatural calm. Inspector Vogel had slept little. The image of the locked room, the dead diplomat, and that curious red rook had followed him through the night. By noon, the case had already begun to spread through certain delicate circles. Dr. Matthias Keller had not merely been a civil servant. He had been a political liaison involved in sensitive communications between European ministries. The missing document from the opened envelope was now considered a matter of international concern. which was precisely why Inspector Vogel found himself standing at the entrance of the Adleroff residence once again, this time awaiting a visitor. The black motorcar arrived shortly after 1 o'clock. From it stepped a small, impeccably dressed gentleman whose appearance seemed almost theatrical against the pale winter backdrop. His coat was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished despite the snow, and above his lip sat the most precise moustache Inspector Vogel had ever seen. Hercule Poirot, the man introduced himself with a courteous incline of the head. Inspector Vogel shook his hand. "I was told you happened to be in Berlin." Poirot smiled faintly. "Mon ami, I am always somewhere interesting when a mystery presents itself." They entered the residence together, the porter watching them nervously as they passed. The building still carried the tense atmosphere of the previous evening. "Nothing has been disturbed since last night?" Poirot asked. "Nothing," Vogel replied. "We sealed the room after the examination." "Très bien." They climbed the stairs, their footsteps echoing softly through the quiet corridor. When they reached room 217, Vogel unlocked the door. Poirot stepped inside slowly. He did not rush forward like a policeman eager to inspect evidence. Instead, he paused just inside the doorway, his sharp eyes sweeping the room as though it were a painting in a gallery. "The body was removed this morning," Vogel said. Poirot nodded. "Naturally." The Belgian detective walked toward the writing desk, where the red rook still rested inside a small evidence tray. He leaned forward slightly, studying it. "A curious calling card," he murmured. "You think it's deliberate?" Poirot gave a soft chuckle. "Inspector, when a man dies alone in a locked room and beside him lies a chess piece, one must assume deliberation." Vogel gestured toward the desk. The envelope contained diplomatic papers. "We believe someone took them." Poirot glanced toward the empty leather portfolio. "And yet the thief left this." He picked up the rook delicately between 2 fingers. "In chess, the rook is straightforward, direct, powerful when the path is clear. You think it's symbolic?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slowly and began examining the rest of the room. The windows first, locked. The balcony door next, also locked. Then he approached the small table beside the armchair where Keller had died. Upon it rested the untouched glass of water the medical examiner had mentioned. Poirot leaned closer. "Interesting." Inspector Vogel stepped beside him. "What is it?" Poirot did not touch the glass. Instead, he pointed to the faint ring of moisture beneath it on the polished wood surface. "You see, Inspector, the glass has been moved." Vogel frowned. "Moved?" "Yes. The condensation mark is slightly wider than the base." Vogel studied it again. Poirot was correct. The faint circle beneath the glass did not match perfectly. "But that could have happened any time," Vogel said. "Perhaps." Poirot turned his gaze toward the chair where Keller had been sitting, then toward the carpet, then toward the door. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell me," he said calmly, "who was the first person to discover that Dr. Keller did not answer his door?" "The night porter. And the courier who was expected. He arrived around 9. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Why," he glassed. Poirot gestured lightly toward the desk again. "You say Dr. Keller did not play chess, yes? That's what the manager told us." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "someone placed a rook in front of him." The little detective set the piece back into the tray with great care. "Which means, my friend, the rook was not meant for Dr. Keller." Vogel stared at him. "Then who was it meant for?" Poirot's moustache twitched ever so slightly. "For us." He turned again, walking slowly toward the door. Just before reaching it, he stopped. His gaze had fallen upon something very small, something the police had overlooked entirely. On the inside brass handle of the door, almost invisible against the polished metal, was a faint smudge of dark blue ink. Poirot leaned closer. Then he smiled. "Ah," he said quietly, "now we begin to see the little lies." Poirot had insisted that Inspector Vogel convene all relevant witnesses in the small drawing-room adjacent to the residence. By mid-afternoon, the space was filled with a tense mixture of diplomats, aides, and staff, each of them nervously aware that their words or their silence might hold consequences far beyond the walls of Berlin. The air was thick with unease, punctuated only by the distant scrape of snow-laden boots on the cobblestones outside. Poirot observed them quietly from a corner, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes flicking from one individual to the next. He did not speak at first. He allowed them to chatter, to hesitate, to fidget. The first to be questioned was the night porter, who had discovered the locked door. Two knocked several times. The young man stammered, but there was no answer. Then I went to get the manager. We tried another key, but it was stuck inside. It wasn't until we forced the door that I saw him. Poirot nodded subtly, then tilted his head, scrutinizing the man. Ah, yes, but tell me, when you returned with the manager, did you notice anything unusual about the air, the smell, the objects? The porter hesitated. No, sir. Everything looked normal. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, the glass of water remained, yes. Yes. The porter frowned. It was strange, but I didn't touch anything. A small twitch at the corner of Poirot's mouth indicated he had noted something far beyond the porter's awareness. Next, he turned to the courier who had been expected at 9. The man was a tall, slender diplomat's aide with precise manners and an expression that seemed rehearsed. I arrived punctually, the aide said smoothly, but Dr. Keller did not answer. I assumed he had stepped out briefly. I left the papers with the porter, as I was instructed. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Ah! You left the envelope. But the envelope was opened when the room was accessed, and the papers are missing. The aide's composure wavered for a fraction of a second. Two do not understand, monsieur. Perhaps someone else. Poirot allowed a slow, deliberate pause. Perhaps. But tell me, you noticed no one else entering the floor? The aide's eyes flickered toward a corner of the room, and then away. Number? Of course not. Poirot made a note in his small leather notebook, barely perceptible. Next, the manager of the Adelhoff residence was questioned. He was a stout man with nervous hands and a careful tongue. Dr. Keller was always private, the manager explained. Even with staff, he would not discuss matters. He did not play chess, and yet this chess piece, I do not know why it was placed there. Poirot inclined his head slowly, his eyes glinting. And the servants, the porter, were they all accounted for the evening? Yes, I believe so, the manager replied quickly. But his voice carried a faint tremor, betraying an anxiety that Poirot caught instantly. Though I cannot swear for certain who passed by the corridor just after 9. Poirot's gaze lingered on him, noting the slight hesitation, the too careful wording. It was always in these half-truths that deception hid. He moved then to a diplomat present in the room, one who had arrived late and was eager to be helpful. I saw nothing, the diplomat insisted. I only arrived to learn of the tragedy. Surely the police are, mon ami, your eagerness is admirable, Poirot interrupted gently. But sometimes eagerness is itself suspicious. Did you notice anything unusual about the porter's actions, or the courier? The diplomat blinked rapidly. No, nothing. Poirot's sharp gaze caught the subtle twitch of his fingers, the too bright flush on his cheeks. Harm. Yes, very well. By the end of the session, Poirot had not accused anyone outright, but he had collected the whispers of contradiction, the courier's fleeting doubt, the manager's hesitation, the diplomat's forced enthusiasm, even the porter's shaky memory. Each testimony was a thread, some frayed, some taut, and Poirot understood that the tapestry they wove concealed far more than it revealed. Stepping back, he allowed a quiet moment of silence to settle over the room. Every witness had spoken. Yet beneath their carefully chosen words lingered a web of hidden motives, subtle lies, and untold fears. Poirot's sharp little eyes swept over them once more, and he smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. Oui. The game is becoming more interesting, he murmured to himself. The moves are no longer invisible. Soon we shall see which player dares to strike first. Poirot spent the evening in quiet reflection, seated by the window of his modest lodgings, watching the dim Berlin street lamps flicker through the settling snow. The voices of the witnesses replayed in his mind, each word weighed, each hesitation noted. Outside, the city murmured with routine life, yet inside, a far more intricate game was afoot, a game where every player concealed a reason, a fear, a desire. He began to arrange the threads in his mind. Dr. Keller had been an influential figure, a man who moved in circles of power and secrecy. To the casual observer, the missing envelope might seem merely a set of diplomatic papers, but to Poirot it represented leverage, temptation, and danger. Each of the witnesses had motives, though varied and veiled. The night porter, young and eager, had access to the corridor at the crucial hour. He was loyal, but loyalty could be swayed, and poverty often whispered into the ears of the desperate. The courier, with his precise demeanor and polished confidence, might appear innocent, but confidence could mask ambition, and ambition often whispered louder than conscience. The manager, nervous and protective of his establishment's reputation, could have feared having some hidden secret that he wanted to conceal at all costs. And the late-arriving diplomat, so eager to assist, seemed to want something beyond cooperation, some advantage cloaked beneath goodwill. Poirot jotted notes with meticulous care, placing each individual in a grid of connections. Keller's recent meetings, the flow of confidential papers, the timing of arrivals and departures, all of it began to form a lattice of opportunity and motive. Greed, he realized, was obvious fear, was subtle revenge, was buried beneath politeness. Jealousy lingered in the spaces between words, where careful phrasing betrayed the faintest trace of resentment. He considered the red rook once more. A simple symbol, yet so deliberate. The choice of a chess piece implied intelligence and intention, a message that the perpetrator wished to convey, either as a warning or a taunt. Whoever had placed it knew Keller would see it, or that the authorities would. The precision of the act suggested familiarity with both the victim and the delicate mechanisms of influence that surrounded him. Poirot revisited the alibis. The porter's insistence on routine was admirable, but he had fumbled with recollections, a small contradiction regarding the time he went to summon the manager. The courier's story was smooth, yet his avoidance of eye contact betrayed an internal conflict he seemed to calculate, measuring how much to reveal. The manager's carefully chose words suggested he was guarding someone or something, and the diplomat's over-eagerness, Poirot thought, might be the mask of guilt, or perhaps simply fear of being suspected. As he examined the web of interactions, a pattern began to emerge, subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer. The missing document, the unusual method of death, and the deliberate placement of the rook were not isolated events. They were linked, each action a piece of a larger strategy. Yet what strategy, and who orchestrated it? Poirot's sharp little eyes narrowed as he considered the possibilities. Could the porter have acted alone, motivated by desperation? Perhaps, but the sophistication of the method suggested experience beyond a novice hand. The courier had opportunity, yes, but would a man in a trusted position risk such exposure for gain? The manager's anxiety hinted at knowledge, but was it knowledge of the crime or merely of the fragile political implications? And the diplomat's eagerness masked a hidden agenda, but what exactly was he protecting? In the quiet of the night, Poirot leaned back, hands clasped, tapping one little finger against his chin. Each motive alone was insufficient, each alibi contained cracks. The solution lay not in a single act, but in the intersections, the hidden connections between those involved. Each thread might be true in isolation, yet the truth of the crime required understanding the weave. Poirot murmured softly to himself, eyes gleaming in the dim light. The motives are tangled, complex, a labyrinth. But every labyrinth has an exit, nest-see pass. One must only observe with the mind, follow the logic, and the path becomes clear. Patience, mon ami, patience. Outside, the Berlin night deepened, concealing the city in shadow and snow. Inside, Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, sorting, connecting, and dissecting. The threads of greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear were beginning to converge, and somewhere within that convergence lay the answer, the key to the puzzle, and the identity of the one who had dared to play such a dangerous game. The following morning brought a flurry of activity to the Berlin police headquarters. Reports had circulated overnight that a breakthrough had been made. A small fragment of blue ink, discovered on the handle of room 217's door, had supposedly matched the pen of one of the suspected aides. The police, eager to close the case before diplomatic tensions escalated further, heralded the finding as decisive. Inspector Vogel, visibly proud, had already begun drafting a report that credited the arrest with bringing swift justice. Poirot arrived at the station mid-morning, the little black notebook in hand, Eyes alert but calm, he listened quietly as the authorities recounted the evidence: the inked handle, the hurriedly confessed movement of papers, and the suspect's awkward testimony. "See," Vogel said triumphantly, "it's all in order. The case is solved." Poirot, however, remained unconvinced. He had observed the crime scene, noted the careful arrangement of the desk, the placement of the red rook, and the subtle contradictions in the witnesses' statements. There was a rhythm to the event's logic that the police had overlooked. The evidence they celebrated, while real, felt like a diversion, a surface layer masking a deeper truth. He asked to see the suspect in question, a young aide who had apparently admitted, under pressure, to briefly handling the documents. The man appeared nervous but compliant, eager to satisfy the authorities. Poirot studied him carefully. The aide's eyes darted not with guilt but with a practiced caution, almost as though he anticipated the questions that would come and had prepared his responses in advance. "You say you moved the envelope?" Poirot asked softly, his voice almost conversational. "Yes, sir," the aide replied. "Just to secure it, that's all. I did not see Dr. Keller. I left the room before anything happened." Poirot leaned closer, his sharp gaze unwavering. "And the red rook?" The aide blinked, clearly taken aback. I do not know what you mean." Poirot straightened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Mon ami, but you must. It was placed deliberately, was it not? For someone to see." The young man shook his head, though unease flickered across his features. Poirot's intuition, honed by countless mysteries, whispered that the aide was truthful only in part. The confession to handling the envelope was convenient, a small truth that masked a larger deception. Inspector Vogel, overhearing the exchange, turned with a satisfied nod. "You see, the case is closed. No more questions are necessary." Poirot did not reply immediately. Instead, he returned to the quiet corner of the station, eyes following the suspect as he was led away. Something about the entire scene struck him as too neat, too tidy. The evidence aligned just enough to satisfy the authorities, but it did not satisfy him, not fully. The real logic of the crime remained hidden, like a shadow in a room, moving unseen. He considered the timing, the alibis, the subtle contradictions, and most of all the deliberate message of the chess rook. Whoever had orchestrated this knew the mechanisms of police procedure, knew how to mislead, and knew that a small fragment of evidence could be manipulated to create the illusion of closure. "Oui," Poirot murmured to himself, pacing the quiet station office. "They celebrate a victory, yet the true criminal remains in the wings, watching, waiting, patient. The rook is still on the board, and the game is far from over." Outside, Berlin stirred to life under a pale morning sun, the snow beginning to melt along the streets. Inside the station, the official machinery of justice had declared triumph. Yet Poirot, ever the observer, understood that the declaration was premature. The real danger had not been confronted. The perpetrator remained in the shadows, confident that the authorities had been fooled and poised to make the next move when the world least expected it. Poirot sat down, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes glinting with quiet determination. The illusion of resolution was seductive to most, but not to him. The case was alive, vibrant with hidden threads, and only the smallest slip or the sharpest observation would reveal the truth. He knew that patience, observation, and the keenest little grey cells would be required. The game had advanced, yes, but the decisive move had yet to be made, and Poirot would be ready. That evening, Poirot returned to the Adelhoff residence under the pretense of reviewing the scene once more, though in truth his mind was following trails invisible to others. The snow had melted into the slick, dark streets, leaving a cold dampness that seeped into his shoes and made the city seem quieter, more secretive. As he entered room 217, now stripped of its immediate evidence and cleaned of all traces of the previous night's horrors, he allowed his gaze to linger on the walls, the floor, the corners, where shadowed details often resided unnoticed. It was then that his eyes fell upon the smallest anomaly, a faint, almost imperceptible crease in the leather of the portfolio that had held the diplomatic papers. The crease was subtle, easily overlooked by those in a rush, yet it suggested that the envelope within had once been folded differently, as if transferred hastily from one hand to another. Poirot touched it lightly with a gloved finger. A memory stirred an old case he had once handled in Brussels, some 12 years prior, involving a missing document, a man of influence, and a carefully placed token meant to mislead the authorities. The resemblance was uncanny. In that older affair, a minor aid had been manipulated to cover the movements of a far more experienced perpetrator. Someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and the ability to anticipate police procedure. Poirot's little grey cells began to hum. The parallel was not mere coincidence. The young aide who had been publicly blamed might be a convenient scapegoat, while the real orchestrator operated from the shadows, shielded by layers of misdirection. He recalled then the subtle connections among the witnesses and suspects. The courier who had delivered the papers, the manager whose nervous demeanor concealed more than mere concern for reputation, and the late-arriving diplomat whose eagerness bordered on performative. On paper, their roles appeared separate, yet, upon closer scrutiny, there were threads linking their shared past encounter at a diplomatic gathering, a business transaction years ago gone awry, and minor debts that had quietly accrued. They had crossed paths in ways the police had ignored, creating a lattice of interactions that now made the crime more intelligible. Poirot's eyes travelled back to the red rook, its glossy surface glinting even under the dim light. Its placement had been deliberate, not for the victim, but for those who observed after the fact. A chess piece, simple and yet strategic silent message from someone who understood both human nature and bureaucracy. And the choice of a rook, he realized, reflected not impulsive emotion but calculated planning. The move of a powerful piece in a limited corridor, controlling the straight paths, dictating the flow of the game. He sat down at the desk, leafing through the documents that had been reproduced for him by the authorities. Names, dates, and notes began to form a hidden map. The missing papers, the ink smudge on the door, the seemingly inconsequential discrepancies in witness statements, all of it pointed back to that shared past. There was a motive buried not merely in the present circumstances of diplomacy and secrecy, but in old grievances and long-standing ambitions. A quiet knock at the door startled him slightly. It was Inspector Vogel, hesitant but curious. "Monsieur Poirot!" "Have you discovered something?" Poirot's small smile did not reach his eyes. "Ah, Inspector, the shadows of the past often linger longer than we suspect. This crime is not simply the product of greed or ambition alone, it is the consequence of a series of old, forgotten entanglements. If one looks closely, one sees that the present is shaped by what came before." Vogel frowned. "You mean the aide we arrested? He is not the true culprit." "Precisely," Poirot said softly, leaning back. "He is but a pawn, caught in a web that began long ago. And the puppeteer, he or she is very much at liberty, observing the moves of others, confident that their past deeds remain invisible. But all is not hidden forever. Patience, observation, and a careful eye, mon ami, will reveal the truth in time." As the night deepened outside, Poirot sat silently, piecing together fragments of memory and evidence. The crime had roots in years gone by, in alliances and betrayals, in grudges that had festered quietly. The present was only the surface. The past had created the intricate lattice upon which the tragedy had been built. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the authorities' celebration, the true criminal remained cloaked in the shadows, waiting for the next move in a game only Poirot could begin to unravel. The next morning, Poirot requested a private audience with the manager of the Adelhoff residence. The man arrived promptly, his demeanor anxious but careful, as though he understood he was under subtle scrutiny, even before any words were exchanged. Poirot invited him to sit, gesturing to a pair of chairs near the fire, though the room itself remained dim and chilly. "Mon ami," Poirot began gently, "I wish to speak of small things. Often, the smallest details betray the greatest secrets." He leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes steady. "Tell me, when you discovered the body, did you notice anything unusual about Dr. Keller's personal habits? Anything at all that might seem trivial?" The manager shifted uneasily. I do not believe so. He was private, yes. Always meticulous, organized, nothing that would seem odd to anyone else." Poirot smiled faintly, tapping his notebook. "Precisely. And yet, you would agree that a man meticulous in life might leave hints, intentional or otherwise, when in danger. The manager's hands twitched.
But I did not see anything unusual.
Poirot nodded slowly, as though absorbing the answer. Then, with a deliberate change of tone, he continued, I wish to test something. A small experiment, if you will. I ask you to help me remember Dr. Keller as he truly was. Think of his gestures, his choices, the little routines. I will show you a few objects, and you must tell me if any of these belong to him, without consulting the papers or anyone else. The manager's eyes narrowed. Objects. Poirot brought from his coat a small collection, a fountain pen, a pocket watch, a chess pawn, and a slip of paper folded precisely like the envelope that had once contained the missing documents. He placed them deliberately on the desk, spacing them evenly, watching the manager closely. Focus on the details, Poirot instructed softly. See if anything resonates with your memory of him. The manager hesitated, then reached toward the items. His hand hovered over the pen, then the pawn, then finally paused above the folded paper. A flicker of recognition, or was it fear, crossed his face. He said nothing, yet the tiny tremor of his hand betrayed him. Poirot leaned forward, voice gentle, almost conspiratorial. Notice, mon ami. The mind remembers even what the heart wishes to forget. You hesitate not because you do not recognize the object, but because it reminds you of something you would rather conceal. The manager swallowed hard, glancing at the pen and then at Poirot. I do not know what you mean. Poirot's small smile widened imperceptibly. And yet your hesitation speaks louder than words. This object has tapped the folded slip, linked to more than a simple memory. It recalls actions, events, the presence of others. Tell me who else might have touched this, or moved it, before the night of the murder. For a brief moment, the manager's composure faltered entirely. His eyes darted to the window as if seeking escape, then back to Poirot. There was someone. A visitor I had not expected, a diplomat who arrived late. He handled the papers briefly, yes, but I did not see what he did with them after. Poirot nodded, eyes twinkling. And this is precisely what I suspected. Your memory, unguarded by the mind's natural defenses, has revealed what deliberate questioning could not. The presence of another connected to past dealings and current events, and the subtle hints left behind, A small, seemingly trivial object, folded paper, has given us more than words ever could. The manager's shoulders sagged, his nervous energy dissipating into quiet acknowledgement. I understand now. I had been trying to protect my establishment's reputation, and yet, in truth, I was revealing more than I intended. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, but there was no triumph in his expression. Instead, he regarded the man with a serene sharpness, aware that the breakthrough he had engineered was only a step. The true criminal, he knew, was still in the shadows, observing the misdirection, confident that their game continued. Yes, mon ami, Poirot murmured softly, tapping the folded slip. A single unconventional clue, and already the first walls of deception begin to crumble. But we must proceed carefully, for the puppet master watches, and the next move may be made before anyone expects it. Outside, the Berlin morning deepened into pale winter light, but inside, the small room held the quiet intensity of revelation. A subtle crack had appeared in the carefully maintained facade of secrecy, and Poirot's mind raced to anticipate the ramifications, each observation a key turning in the complex lock of truth. That afternoon, Poirot returned to the police archives, intending to review the copies of Dr. Keller's documents and the evidence gathered from the Adelhoff residence. The room was quiet, the muted hum of Berlin life outside creating a stark contrast to the careful order within. He set his notebook and small leather satchel on the table, preparing to cross-reference timelines, signatures, and annotations. For a moment, everything seemed in place. The copies of the diplomatic papers, the photographs of the crime scene, even the small tray holding the red rook were arranged precisely as they had been delivered. Poirot leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against his chin. Then a sharp sound almost imperceptible caught his attention. He turned swiftly. only to find the room empty. The door had been secured, locked from the outside. Yet when he returned his gaze to the evidence tray, the red rook was gone. The documents he had intended to examine were missing. Even the small folded slip of paper, the clue that had revealed the manager's hidden knowledge, had vanished. Poirot rose slowly, his calm demeanor unwavering, though his eyes glittered with sharp intensity. He examined the lock, the windows, the small ventilation grate near the ceiling, every potential entrance and exit, but saw no sign of forced entry. Whoever had taken the items had done so with care, knowledge, and precision. Inspector Vogel arrived moments later, summoned by the assistant archivist, who had discovered the absence. His face was pale with alarm. "Monsieur Poirot, the evidence, it's gone." "Yes, I see," Poirot said quietly, running a gloved hand over his moustache. "And the manner of its disappearance tells us more than the presence of the evidence ever could. Observe, Inspector, no disturbance, no hasty footprints. This was no act of desperation. Someone wishes the truth to remain hidden, and they are prepared to manipulate both the evidence and our perceptions to achieve it." Vogel frowned. "But who could do such a thing, and why?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Mon ami, consider the list of those with knowledge, opportunity, and motive. The aide, the diplomat, the manager, even the courier. But the one who would benefit most from the erasure of these items is the person whose identity the documents expose, the hand that orchestrates from the shadows. We now see clearly that the game has shifted. They are aware of our progress, and they are intervening to delay the inevitable revelation. The implications were profound. Without the documents, the missing envelope, and the red rook, the puzzle seemed at first insurmountable. Yet Poirot's mind, always turning, considered alternative paths. The theft itself was a clue act of the perpetrator's psychology, a signature of arrogance and confidence. Only someone intimately familiar with the procedures and with knowledge of how Poirot worked could have executed such a removal so cleanly. He paused, recalling the subtle cracks in the manager's composure, the careful avoidance in the diplomat's gaze, the fleeting doubt in the courier's eyes. Each of them could have been manipulated, each a potential pawn, yet the precision of the theft suggested a more experienced, handsome one calculating the right moment to strike, someone observing even the observers. Poirot tapped his fingers together, his mind racing through possibilities. "Yes, They think by removing the evidence, they halt the investigation. But no, the truth is not contained solely within paper, nor in the object itself. The mind, mon ami, is far more revealing than any document. The fingerprints of motive, opportunity, and subtle deception remain." Vogel stared, still pale and unsettled. "So, we continue without it?" "Precisely," Poirot said with quiet confidence. "We proceed, but we must now be doubly vigilant. The thief is aware, clever, and patient. They will test our observation, attempt to mislead, and perhaps even strike again. Trust is fragile, Inspector, for in this city, shadows move swiftly, and some hands are unseen until it is far too late. Yet, if we observe closely, the true pattern will emerge, and the hidden hand will reveal itself not through documents or tokens, but through the very nature of its deception." Outside, the early winter light waned, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Inside, the room held the quiet tension of a challenge. The stakes had risen, and the game had grown infinitely more dangerous. Poirot's gaze remained steady, eyes fixed on the possibilities. The vanishing evidence was a warning, not a defeat. The true criminal was still at work, but Poirot knew that every move left a trace, and every trace, no matter how slight, would ultimately guide him to the truth. The following evening, the Berlin streets were cloaked in mist, a damp chill settling over the cobblestones. Poirot had returned to his lodgings, reviewing the events of the past days with his customary precision. The disappearance of the evidence weighed heavily on his mind, and he had spent hours reconstructing the possibilities, considering every subtle detail: the manager's trembling hands, the diplomat's forced politeness, the courier's fleeting glance of uncertainty. He was piecing together the invisible web, yet the shadows beyond his reach seemed to shift as quickly as he moved. A sharp, insistent knock at the door broke his concentration. He opened it to find the night porter, pale and breathless. "Monsieur Poirot, there has been Another incident. At the embassy, Poirot's eyebrows rose. Another incident? Yeah. Dr. Keller's assistant, Herr Albrecht, has been found dead. Poirot's mind snapped into motion. Dead? How? The porter swallowed. It is unclear. The body was discovered in his private quarters. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, but his voice trembled. There was a note, a chess bishop, placed upon his desk. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. A chess bishop, diagonally strategic, less direct than the rook, a signal with intent. He sensed immediately the meaning. The murderer was not finished, and the selection of the piece was deliberate, a coded continuation of the game he had already begun to unravel. "Show me the scene," Poirot said calmly, gathering his coat and gloves. The porter led him quickly through the fogged streets to the embassy. Guards barred entry, but upon revealing his credentials and explaining the urgency, Poirot was ushered inside. Herr Albrecht's quarters were neat, almost sterile, the faint aroma of cologne masking the underlying trace of chemical disturbance. The body sat slumped in a chair beside the desk, expression peaceful yet unnatural, much like Dr. Keller's. The note lay beside the chess bishop, a folded slip of paper marked with a single sharp line of ink. Poirot crouched beside it, examining the handwriting carefully. It was faint, deliberate, almost teasing, meant to be discovered, but offering no direct message. He glanced about the room, noting the lack of forced entry, the undisturbed glass of water, the arrangement of papers and personal items. The murderer had repeated the method, and yet the signal was clearer this time, a second move in the ongoing game. Inspector Vogel arrived soon after, visibly shaken. "Monsieur Poirot, I thought we had them contained. How could this happen?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved slowly about the room, studying each detail, his mind piecing together the new pattern. The criminal is clever, yes, but not infallible. Observe, mon ami. The choice of the bishop is a message, not just a token. It tells us they are aware of our methods, aware that we follow patterns, yet confident in their ability to misdirect. And the slip of paper, he picked it up delicately, glancing at the faint crease, contains a subtle clue, visible only to one who observes with patience and precision. Vogel frowned. A warning? Yes. And perhaps a challenge, Poirot replied softly. The murderer wishes to prolong the game, to test our perception, to see if we can anticipate the next move before another life is claimed. The danger is immediate. We are no longer merely solving a crime. We must act to prevent the next. He rose, pacing the room with his small, quick steps. The shadows are moving faster than before. Each suspect is now a potential player, each prior observation a key. The removal of evidence, the choice of chess pieces, the pattern of killing these are not random. Someone is orchestrating this with care, a strategy designed to manipulate, to frighten, to conceal the truth. And unless we anticipate the next move, the consequences will be far graver. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the Berlin streets in silence. Inside, Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The villain was several steps ahead, yes, but steps could be measured, moves anticipated. The game had escalated, and now it was not merely about revelation but survival. Each passing minute brought the potential for tragedy, and Poirot knew that only by observing the smallest of details, the subtlest of gestures, could he hope to prevent another life from being claimed in this meticulously calculated game of shadows. Poirot spent the remainder of the evening in careful contemplation, returning once more to his modest lodgings with the soft fog curling around the Berlin streets outside. He placed the photographs, sketches, and copies of the documents in a meticulous arrangement on his small writing desk. Allowing his mind to trace the flow of events, the movement of people, the subtleties that had been overlooked by even the most diligent officers. Each witness, each suspect, each carefully positioned chess piece seemed disconnected at first, but Poirot trusted in the principle that the smallest detail often held the largest truth. He reopened the manager's earlier statement in his mind, recalling the hesitation when confronted with the folded slip of paper and the subtle tremor when certain objects were presented. He thought of the courier, whose polished confidence had briefly cracked when pressed about a minor inconsistency in the timeline. The diplomat's eagerness, once taken as mere helpfulness, now seemed to shimmer with something more, unspoken anxiety about being observed, and then he remembered the faint smudge of blue ink on the interior door handle of Keller's room. Such a small mark, easily dismissed, yet Poirot had noted it immediately, sensing its importance. He leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, eyes narrowing. One observation resurfaced with a clarity he had not fully appreciated: the caretaker's remark about Keller's meticulous habits. Nothing unusual, the man had said, but his voice had carried a faint tension, a subtle incongruence with his words. Poirot had felt, even then, that this inconsistency was not merely a lapse in memory, it was a pointer, a small deviation from routine that illuminated a hidden truth. Suddenly, it aligned in his mind the sequence of events, the positioning of the chess pieces, the seemingly minor gestures. Each murder, each disappearance, each carefully placed symbol followed a principle of progression, like moves in a game. The rook, the bishop, the methodical disappearance of documents, they were not random but strategic. And now, the faint, almost invisible smudge of ink revealed the link between the two victims and the orchestrator. The thief had touched the door to mask their entry or exit, confident that the mark would be interpreted as inconsequential. Yet it was a signal, and signals were only left by those confident of their knowledge of the board. Poirot rose and began pacing, small steps, deliberate, tracing the lines of logic across the room, as if the furniture itself might whisper secrets. It struck him that all the elements stimulating, gestures, minor hesitations, the choice of chess pieces were connected by one thread: predictability. The criminal had relied upon the predictable patterns of human behavior, exploiting small, habitual actions. And yet, in every calculated act, the perpetrator had unwittingly left a counterpoint, a small signature that betrayed their design. He returned to the copies of the documents, scanning each annotation carefully. The missing papers, the folded slip, and the placement of the rook and bishop all pointed toward the same individual, someone who had knowledge of Keller's routines, of the embassy staff, and of the psychology of those around them. The pattern was no longer obscure. It was elegant, cruel, and deliberate, but it was visible to the keen eye. Poirot allowed himself a faint, approving smile.
Ah, yes. The pattern, mon ami, was here all along.
Invisible to the untrained, hidden in plain sight, yet consistent, precise, and inescapable. One only needed patience, attention, and the willingness to observe what others dismiss as trivial. He sat down again, picking up the red rook that had survived the earlier thefts. Its polished surface reflected the lamplight, glinting as though it had been waiting for him to notice. The pieces, the ink, the subtle deviations in behaviorally of it converged into a single coherent picture. The criminal's movements, the timing of the deaths, the misdirection, it was no longer a chaotic series of events. It was a game, laid bare, and the rules had been in front of him all along.
Yes.
Poirot whispered softly, eyes gleaming. The board is set. And now, the final moves may be anticipated. While inside, the fog deepened, Berlin holding its breath. While inside, Poirot prepared to confront the invisible hand that had orchestrated the deadly sequence of events, the promise of revelation. Poirot spent the following morning in quiet deliberation, retracing each step, revisiting each observation, and allowing the emerging pattern to guide his reasoning. He returned to the embassy and requested to speak once more with the diplomat who had so carefully cultivated an air of helpfulness. The man arrived, polite but visibly tense, as though he sensed, without fully understanding, that the subtle game had now entered a phase from which there was no retreat. "Mon ami," Poirot began softly, leaning forward, hands clasped on the desk, "we have been studying the movements, the gestures, the choices. It is clear that some motives are not immediately apparent. They hide behind layers of ambition, behind appearances of propriety. But the truth is rarely invisible. One must merely observe carefully." The diplomat's hands trembled slightly.
I do not know what you mean.
Poirot's eyes narrowed.
Ah, but you do, yes.
"Tell me, when you handled the papers, did you act out of duty, or was there something more personal at stake? Something that transcends diplomacy, finance, even revenge?" The man's composure cracked for the first time. He pressed his hands to the desk, leaning forward, eyes darting away from Poirot's unblinking gaze. It was not simply the papers. I could not bear the thought of them falling into the wrong hands. But that is not all. Not just wrong hands. I could not bear the betrayal, the dishonor, what they might do to my family, my name, my legacy. And I saw no other way. I thought, if I controlled the situation, I could prevent disaster. Poirot listened intently, allowing the confession to unfold like the slow opening of a flower. And so the deaths, the disappearance of evidence, the careful placement of chess pieces, all designed to manipulate perception, to shield yourself from exposure while achieving your aim. The diplomat nodded miserably, the tension in his shoulders finally giving way.
Yes, I did not intend to kill at first.
But once the first act was committed, once I saw the pieces falling into place, I feared that hesitation would ruin everything. I thought of Dr. Keller's ambition, of the documents, of the subtle threats that could destroy all that I hold dear, and so I continued. Each step seemed necessary, inevitable. Each death, a measure of control, of prevention. Poirot leaned back, folding his hands neatly, his expression one of serene understanding.
Now we see the full picture.
Not merely greed, not merely revenge, not merely envy. This was a crime of psychological pressure, of fear transformed into obsession. You sought to control the world around you, to protect yourself, to preserve an ideal, and in doing so, you became entangled in a web from which only extreme measures could maintain the illusion of safety. The diplomat shuddered. I never imagined it would come to this. I thought I could guide events quietly, invisibly, but everything spiraled beyond my control. Yes, Poirot said softly, eyes glinting. The mind, mon ami, when pressured by fear, is capable of extraordinary and sometimes horrifying ingenuity. The choices you made were not random, they were carefully constructed, each one a response to a perceived threat, each one a miscalculated step in a complex strategy designed to protect yourself. Yet the very ingenuity that shielded you also revealed you. Subtle gestures, small contradictions, a misplaced ink smudge, all betray the underlying psychology. That is why the game was visible to the observant, even when it was invisible to others. The diplomat slumped in his chair, a mixture of exhaustion and resignation clouding his expression. Poirot's little grey cells had followed the invisible thread, tracing motive not just through opportunity and alibi, but through the hidden pressures, fears, and obsessions that had driven the criminal's mind. What had seemed a maze of random, chaotic actions was revealed now as a deliberate path carved by anxiety, obsession, and the desire to dominate fate itself. Poirot rose, smoothing his coat. Mon ami, the truth is seldom simple. It is rarely clean. Yet every action, every misdirection, every death has meaning. The hidden motive has been revealed, not one of mere ambition, but of fear and the perilous desire to control the uncontrollable. And now, we may bring this tragic game to its conclusion, with understanding of both the crime and the mind that wrought it. Outside, Berlin's pale winter sun began to pierce the morning mist, illuminating the streets that had held such darkness. Inside, the true motive had finally been laid bare, exposing the depths to which a man's mind could descend when driven by fear and obsession, and setting the stage for justice to follow. Poirot spent the remainder of the morning in quiet preparation, arranging every detail of what he knew, every subtle hint, and every anticipated move of the criminal in his mind. He had traced the web of deceit, studied the psychological patterns, and mapped the invisible pathways that led from Dr. Keller's initial murder to the death of Herr Albrecht. Now, the time had come to act, and he intended to do so with the precision of a master strategist. He summoned Inspector Vogel and a small team to a secure location within the embassy, explaining that a meeting had been arranged with the diplomat under the guise of a discussion about the missing papers. Poirot had subtly leaked information indicating that further evidence would be presented, baiting the criminal to reveal himself or make a mistake. Everything depended on patience, observation, and the careful orchestration of timing. The diplomat arrived, accompanied by his usual air of nervous confidence, and was shown into a room where the table was arranged with deliberate simplicity. A few papers, a chessboard with the rook and bishop placed in their final positions, and Poirot himself seated calmly, his sharp gaze unwavering. The tension was immediate, a palpable weight that seemed to press the air from the room. "Mon ami," Poirot began softly, "we have discussed the events of the past days, the movements, the choices, the subtle signals left behind. And yet, there remain questions that require the truth." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "The game has been played meticulously. Yes, each piece placed, each action calculated. And yet, one does not make such moves without a reason, n'est-ce pas?" The diplomat's hand twitched slightly, betraying the control he had tried so carefully to maintain. I do not know what you mean," he said, though his voice wavered. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but you do. You see, the paper, the chess pieces, the subtle smudge of ink, they are all part of a pattern, a signature. A mind such as yours cannot hide in plain sight indefinitely. The pressure, the fear, the desire to control all of it is visible to those who observe." The diplomat shifted, rising from his chair, eyes darting to the window as though considering escape. Poirot's gaze followed him, unflinching. "You may rise, but where will you go?" "The room is sealed, the exits watched. The moment of truth has arrived, and the options are few." A bead of sweat formed on the diplomat's brow. "I did what I thought necessary. I never intended to kill." "Intent is clear, mon ami, but consequences follow intent, do they not?" Poirot said calmly. "Your fear of exposure, your obsession with control, these have led to death and deception. The Red Rook, the Bishop, the stolen documents, all clever misdirections to protect yourself. Yet cleverness is not perfection. Every action leaves a trace, and you have left enough for the observant mind to follow." The diplomat's shoulders slumped, resignation overtaking panic. He sank back into the chair, voice low. "Yes, it is true. I handled the documents. I tried to manage the situation. I did not foresee everything spiraling as it has." Poirot nodded gently, folding his hands. "And now, mon ami, we have all the pieces. The game is complete, and the player must face the consequences of their moves." He gestured slightly, and Inspector Vogel stepped forward, solemn but assured. The diplomat looked from Poirot to Vogel, then back to the chessboard, the symbolism of the pieces striking him suddenly. I understand," he whispered. "It was all visible. I cannot escape." Poirot's little grey cells had done their work. The criminal's mind, once so cunning and hidden, had been exposed through the careful observation of patterns, the anticipation of human behavior, and the subtle orchestration of circumstance. What had seemed chaotic, terrifying, and inscrutable had been reduced to logic, psychology, and inevitability. As the authorities led the diplomat away, Poirot remained seated, calm and composed, his eyes lingering for a moment on the chessboard. The pieces had told the story, the moves had been anticipated. The final confrontation had been completed not with force or anger, but with quiet reasoning, patience, and the precise application of observation and intellect. Outside, the pale Berlin winter light fell across the streets, and within the room, the shadow that had haunted the city for days was at last brought to light, the game concluded, and justice quietly restored. Poirot allowed a brief moment of satisfaction as the diplomat was escorted from the embassy, the weight of tension lifting from the room. Inspector Vogel, visibly relieved, began drafting the official statements, confident that the nightmare had reached its conclusion. Yet Poirot did not rise, nor did he allow his mind to rest. Something still tugged at the edges of his consciousness, a small, insistent irregularity that refused to be ignored. He returned to the chessboard, the rook and bishop still in place, their symbolism heavy with the narrative of the crimes. He studied them again, turning them slowly between his fingers, recalling the timing of the murders, the subtle movements of the aide, the hesitant glances of the manager, and the courier's fleeting expressions. One detail, almost imperceptible, began to insist upon itself. The placement of the bishop in Herr Albrecht's room had been slightly off-center. Too deliberate to be accidental, yet curiously precise in a way that suggested a secondary layer of meaning, one that had gone unnoticed, even in the careful orchestration of his trap. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The moves, the pieces, the documents, they had all pointed to the diplomat. Yes, but why had the bishop been positioned so oddly? Why had the folded slip of paper been delivered in such a manner that it required careful interpretation? His mind raced, revisiting every statement, every hesitation, every contradiction he had encountered over the past days. Then it struck him, the aide, the young man who had been publicly blamed early on, the one who had trembled when presented with the folded slip and had confessed only to handling the envelope. He had seemed nervous, yes, but there had always been a subtle honesty in his fear. He had not been clever enough to orchestrate the murders, yet clever enough to understand that the real culprit could manipulate him into becoming a scapegoat. His role had been observed, studied, and leveraged by someone with a greater understanding of the entire game. Poirot's heart quickened with clarity. The diplomat had acted, certainly, but not entirely alone. Someone else had orchestrated the final arrangements, someone who knew the patterns of human behavior better than anyone, someone who had ensured that even when the diplomat was caught, there remained a smokescreen, a final misdirection. He moved swiftly to the aide's quarters, where the young man had been waiting quietly, unsure of his fate. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice calm yet edged with quiet intensity. "You have been observant, yes. You notice subtleties others ignored, and yet you were not fully aware of the shadow that guided the hand of the diplomat." The aide's eyes widened. "You mean there's someone else, someone who really planned this?" Poirot nodded. "Yeah. Someone whose motives are subtle, whose presence has been masked by the chaos we observed. The diplomat acted out of fear and desire to control, but the true mastermind, yes, the architect of the sequence of moves, has remained hidden until now, and their signature is visible not in grand gestures but in the smallest of details, overlooked by all but the keenest of observers." The aide swallowed, fear and relief mingling. "Two don't understand. Who could it be?" Poirot's eyes glinted with the thrill of revelation. "It is not always the obvious suspect, mon ami. Observe the patterns, the inconsistencies, the hesitations, and you will see that the real hand has been directing events from behind a veil. A final move, a last-minute twist, designed to test even the most careful detective. And now the game has truly entered its last phase." Outside, the winter light of Berlin faded into dusk, streets swallowed in grey mist. Inside, Poirot's little grey cells raced with the exhilaration of discovery. The initial resolution had been a necessary step, yes, but the case was not yet complete. The true architect of the chaos had revealed themselves only through the smallest, almost invisible misalignments, the final brilliant twist that demanded the full measure of his genius. Poirot's expression was serene, almost gentle, yet his mind was ablaze. The pieces had been set, the layers of deception peeled back, and the true challenge now awaited. Unmasking the hidden mastermind, exposing the final deception, and ensuring that justice was not only done, but observed by those clever enough to attempt to hide it. The game was at its most dangerous, and the detective's genius would be tested as never before. Poirot spent the evening meticulously retracing every step, every observation, every gesture that had led him to suspect the hidden mastermind. By the time the Berlin streets were cloaked in darkness and the lamps cast long, wavering shadows across the cobblestones, he had a clear picture of the final player. It was someone no one had suspected. The courier, the seemingly inconsequential figure who had delivered messages and papers, moving quietly in the background, never drawing attention. Subtle glances, minor hesitations, a precise understanding of each person's habits and all signs overlooked by the authorities, but noticed by Poirot's ever-watchful eye. He arranged a meeting at a discreet location, under the pretense of a debriefing regarding the missing documents. The courier arrived, calm, professional, seemingly untroubled, yet a small flicker in the eyes betrayed recognition, the awareness that Poirot had deduced more than anyone else could see. "Monsieur," Poirot said gently, "we have traced the threads, observed the patterns, and now the picture is complete. You have orchestrated much of what has transpired, have you not?" The courier's expression remained impassive, but his hands tightened around the envelope he carried. I only followed instructions," he said carefully. "I never intended for anyone to die." Poirot inclined his head slowly. "Ah, but you see, the consequences of one's actions do not always align with intention. Every detail, every minor action left a trace. The misplaced ink smudge, the folded slips, The timing of each movement, all were within your control, yet each choice revealed your hand to one who observes. The courier's eyes flickered, calculating. And what if I leave now? What if I disappear as I have done before? Poirot's smile was faint, serene, unyielding. You may attempt to vanish, mon ami, but the traces remain. And yet, justice is not always immediate, nor absolute. One may escape for a time, but the pattern of behavior, the psychology, the minute details, they do not vanish. One day, the consequences will meet you. You may depart, yes, but the truth of your actions will persist, and the mind that observes will always remember. A shadow passed over the courier's face. Without another word, he slipped away into the night, disappearing into the Berlin streets, leaving behind only a folded slip of paper. Poirot picked it up, examining it carefully. The handwriting, the crease, the subtle mark in the corner revealed the meticulous orchestration of events, the hidden strategy that had allowed the courier to operate unseen. The villain had escaped, yet not unobserved. The evidence of intellect and pattern remained as proof, a record of the careful mind behind the chaos. Poirot rose and spoke to Inspector Vogel, who had followed, anxious yet deferential. "Mon ami, observe." The diplomat acted from fear and desire for control. The true mastermind, however, remained in the shadows, guiding actions through subtle manipulations. Most would have accepted the first arrest as resolution, yet the smallest inconsistencies, hesitations, smudges, misplaced objects, offhand comments revealed the deeper truth. It is not always the one who acts in the spotlight who controls the game, but the one who understands the pattern of all players. Vogel nodded slowly, comprehension dawning. So, the courier was the real architect. We missed it because we looked for the obvious. Exactly, Poirot said, folding his hands neatly. One must observe beyond the surface, consider human nature, habits, and the psychology of fear and ambition. The traces left by thought, by calculation, are never entirely invisible, and in this case they revealed a hidden hand, even when it seemed that all was complete. As the night deepened, the streets of Berlin were quiet once more, yet a subtle tension lingered, the unsettling sense that the criminal had walked free, leaving behind only the evidence of intellect and planning. Poirot stood at the window, gazing at the fog-shrouded city. Justice had been partially served, the immediate threat neutralized, the motives exposed, the sequence of events clarified. Yet the escape of the courier left an edge of unease, a reminder that even the most brilliant deduction cannot always constrain human cunning entirely. Poirot's eyes glimmered with quiet satisfaction and contemplation. The game was concluded, the pattern revealed, the mind behind the deception exposed, and still, in the shadows beyond the window, Berlin whispered of mysteries yet unresolved. The detective's genius had prevailed, yet the final truth lingered, a testament to the delicate balance between justice achieved and justice deferred. Poirot left the embassy as the last traces of winter twilight faded into night, the Berlin streets glistening faintly from an earlier drizzle. The air was cool, carrying the distant murmur of traffic and the occasional clatter of a horse-drawn carriage, city quietly resuming its rhythm after the turmoil of the past days. Yet, despite the sense of closure, Poirot's mind was far from settled. Small threads of uncertainty tugged at him, subtle discrepancies he could not dismiss. As he walked, he considered the courier's escape. The man had acted with intelligence and precision, leaving only a folded slip of paper behind, its contents cryptic yet deliberate. Poirot had studied it in the embassy, tracing the faint crease, the particular bend of the ink, the deliberate choice of wording. It was a signature, a message meant to be interpreted or misinterpreted by those observing, a reminder that even the mastermind had left a whisper of themselves for those patient enough to notice. A thought struck him suddenly. One small annotation on Dr. Keller's original document, overlooked in the chaos of discovery, had not been fully explained. The diplomat's fear had driven him to act. Yes, and the courier had orchestrated the chain of events, but the origin of that particular note's cryptic reference to an old Berlin registry had never been traced. Why had it been written in that way? Who had ensured that it remained, almost as if planted for an observant mind to discover? Poirot paused, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, gazing at the mist curling over the cobblestones. The city seemed empty, yet he knew better. Shadows often concealed the smallest movements, the faintest gestures, and the most telling secrets. Somewhere in Berlin, someone knew more than they had revealed. Perhaps it was the courier himself, perhaps another hand that had slipped unnoticed between the players. Perhaps there remained a subtle game, one even he had not yet fully perceived. He thought, too, of the chessboard, the rook and bishop, symbols of strategy, of planned maneuvering. The final moves had been made, the sequence revealed, yet chess, like life, often contained hidden gambits and quiet reversals. He could not shake the feeling that a final twist, subtle and unanticipated, lingered just beyond the reach of immediate observation. The courier had escaped, but had he truly left all his cards on the table? Poirot's pace resumed, steady and deliberate, each step measured, each thought carefully considered. The city, for all its quiet streets and dim lamplight, felt alive with potential secrets. He reflected on human nature, on the interplay of fear, ambition, and intellect. Each case left echoes, residue in the minds and actions of those involved, traces that persisted long after the apparent resolution. And so, though the immediate threat had been neutralized, the story, as always, was never truly complete. Passing beneath the soft glow of a gas lamp, Poirot allowed himself a faint, contemplative smile. The diplomat had confessed, the crimes had been exposed, and the hidden patterns revealed, but the courier's absence, the cryptic slip, the untraced annotation they whispered of mysteries still unresolved. Perhaps another day, another subtle movement would illuminate the final truth. Perhaps another game would begin, quietly, behind the calm exterior of Berlin's streets. As he turned a corner into a quieter avenue, his figure blending with the shadows, Poirot's mind already began to plot the next steps, the next observations, the next revelations. The city was vast, its secrets layered, and one could never rest too long in complacency. Yet in that quiet certainty of observation, there was satisfaction. The immediate puzzle had been solved, justice achieved, and the patterns discerned. Still, even as the night closed over him, the lingering question remained, as always, what subtle truth, hidden in plain sight, awaited discovery tomorrow. And so, with the faintest curl of his moustache and the glimmer of intellect sharpening in his eyes, Hercule Poirot disappeared into the Berlin mist, leaving behind a city that had witnessed resolution but also the quiet, persistent promise that a mystery never truly ends.